The station shook before I even reached my desk. I was halfway down Corridor 7 of Axis Prime when the emergency lights snapped on, that cold, pale red that makes every face look like it belongs to a ghost. The floor vibrated under my boots, not from an explosion nearby, from something much farther away. Something big enough to rattle the bones of a space station 2-star systems distant. I broke into a run. My name is Marcus Vale. At the time I was 29 years old, working as a junior liaison for humanity's diplomatic seat on the Galactic Conclave. My job, officially, was to attend low-priority briefings, file reports that senior delegates would skim and set aside, and make sure the coffee machine in the human wing stayed stocked. Unofficially, I was there to learn, to watch how the older species moved through these halls. The Vrakai with their broad, armored shoulders and voices like gravel sliding down a slope. The Lethene who communicated in layered harmonics that required a translation collar just to follow. The enormous and patient Karathi, who had been members of the Conclave longer than humanity had possessed written language. I had been on Axis Prime for 11 months. I had not yet done a single thing that mattered, that changed in the next 4 minutes. The briefing room on level 3 was already packed when I pushed through the door. Delegates, aides, translation staff, and security personnel were crowded around the central display table, which projected a rotating map of the outer territories. 3 points on that map pulsed in harsh, angry orange. My stomach dropped before anyone said a word. Delegate Cornwell, our senior human representative, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of stillness that comes from surviving a career full of bad news, was standing at the far end of the table. She did not look at the display. She was looking at the floor. That scared me more than the map. I pushed close enough to read the coordinates: Luden's Reach, Port Calvary, the settlement cluster called New Eden's Gate. 3 human colony worlds. The orbital strike data came through in the next 60 seconds. Automated defense logs, time-stamped and brutal in their clarity. The Vrakai Dominion had sent fleets, not border patrol vessels, not survey ships, not the kind of low-profile presence that could be explained away as a navigation error. Full combat formations. The kind you send when you are not confused about where you are or what you are doing. The strikes had begun 9 hours earlier. They had been over within 40 minutes. The numbers appearing beside each colony name were not ship counts or structural damage assessments. They were people. How many had been on the surface? How many had been in the orbital stations above? How many signals had gone silent? I will not repeat those numbers here. I wrote them down once. That was enough. Delegate Cornwell finally raised her head and looked at the room. Her voice was completely level. We need a formal request for emergency session. Get the chamber secretary. Get our legal team. Get everyone. She paused. And someone find out if any of our people on those worlds had time to reach shelters. Nobody answered that last part. The silence said everything. The emergency session of the Galactic Conclave convened 6 hours later. I had attended 17 conclave sessions in my 11 months on Axis Prime. Most of them were slow, procedural things, trade boundary reviews, resource claim filings, the long and technically detailed arguments about which species held prior rights to which asteroid belts in which sectors. They were important, I was told. They were the machinery of galactic civilization. They kept the peace between species who could, if they chose, reduce each other to rubble. This session was different the moment the chamber doors opened. The great hall of the conclave was shaped like the inside of a shell, curved, tiered, every seat angled toward the central speaking floor. The acoustics were designed so that even a whisper could be heard clearly at the highest tier. It held representatives from 31 recognized species. Every seat was filled. I found a spot in the upper observation gallery reserved for junior staff and attaches, and I stood because there were no empty chairs. The Vrakai delegation sat in their section, with the composure of people who had prepared for this moment. Their lead ambassador was a male named Drathkovan, tall even by Vrakai standards, with a formal state robe the color of deep bronze. He sat with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something that looked almost like boredom. Delegate Cornwell stood at the human-speaking position. She presented the strike data without emotional emphasis. Times, coordinates, verified casualty estimates, the chain of command signatures recovered from Vrakai military transmissions that placed the order directly within the Dominion's high command structure. It was not a speech. It was a delivery of evidence, clean and irrefutable. When she finished, the chamber fell into the kind of quiet that has weight. Then Drathkovan rose. He was not apologetic. He did not even attempt the diplomatic language of regret that lesser offenses typically called for in that chamber. He described the strikes as a territorial correction. Those were his words, spoken clearly, without hesitation. in response to human expansion patterns that the Dominion had assessed as encroaching on historically claimed Vrakai space. He said that the Dominion had acted within what it considered its sovereign rights. He said that the colonies in question had been established on contested ground. He said that he hoped the matter could now be considered resolved, and that humanity would take note of where the Dominion's interests lay. He sat back down. The murmur that moved through the chamber was not outrage. It was the sound of 36 species calculating, adjusting, deciding where they stood. Watched faces across the tiers. Some were grim. Some were carefully neutral. A few I noticed with a sickness that settled deep in my chest seemed to be nodding. Cornwell requested the floor again. Before she could speak, the chamber secretary announced that a motion had already been submitted, not by the Vrakai, but by a coalition of 5 mid-tier species, to open a formal review of humanity's recent territorial expansion. The review, if approved, would require humanity to suspend all new colony activity, pending a full assessment. They were not punishing the Vrakai for what they had done. They were moving to punish humanity for existing in the wrong places. I gripped the railing of the observation gallery and did not let go. It was then that Savarath rose. I had seen the Karathi elder in sessions before, but always at a distance, up close from even the gallery height. He was striking in the way that truly ancient things are striking, not because of size or dramatic appearance, but because of the quality of stillness around him. The Karathi were long-lived even by galactic standards. Savarath was, by documented record, 712 years old. He had been attending conclave sessions since before humanity had broken out of its own solar system. When he rose to speak, the chamber went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet for Cornwell or for Drathkovan. It was the quiet of genuine attention. Savarath did not look at the Vrakai delegation. He looked at the chamber. He spoke slowly, in galactic standard, and the translation collar at my ear rendered it in plain English. He said that he had been a member of this body for longer than most of the species present had held interstellar capability. He said that in those centuries, he had watched many conflicts begin. He said that he had seen aggressive acts answered with silence, and he had seen what that silence eventually produced. Then he said something that made every person in that chamber go absolutely still. He said, "Do not do this to the humans, not because they are powerful, not because they have great fleets or advanced weapons or a history of military conquest. Do not do this because of what they are. I have studied their history. I have read their wars, their losses, their patterns. They are not like the species you have dealt with before. When other species suffer a wound like this, they grieve and they negotiate, and eventually they accept a new boundary. Humans do not accept, they do not let go, they do not move on. They remember every single name of every single person they have lost, and they carry that weight forward until they have done something with it. If you dismiss what was done to these 3 worlds today, and let the Dominion walk out of this chamber without consequence, you will not have ended something. You will have started something, and I promise you, I say this not as a threat, but as the observation of a very old witness. You do not want to be on the receiving end of what you will have started." He sat down. Drathkovan let out a sound that, through the translation collar, came through as a low, dismissive laugh. It was quiet, barely audible, but the acoustics of the chamber carried it perfectly. Someone in the Lurithin section made a harmonic sound that my collar translated as something close to amusement. 2 or 3 delegates in the middle tiers exchanged glances and small, private smiles. The motion to review humanity's territorial expansion passed with 22 votes in favor. No punishment was issued to the Vrakai Dominion. No censure. No formal rebuke. Nothing. Cornwell gathered her materials and walked out of the chamber with her head up and her face giving away. Nothing. I watched her go. I watched the chamber begin its low, resuming hum of procedural conversation, as if the world had not just shifted under our feet. I stayed in the gallery a moment longer. I took out the small notebook I kept in my jacket pocket, a real notebook paper, the kind that doesn't need a power source or a network connection. I opened it to the first page, and I wrote the names of the 3 colonies. Ludens Reach, Port Calvary, New Eden's Gate. Beneath each name I wrote the number that had appeared on that briefing room display beside it. Then below all 3 I wrote the total. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I closed the notebook, put it back in my pocket, and walked out of the chamber. I did not cry. I did not speak to anyone on the way back to the human wing. I remember thinking very clearly and very quietly that Savarath was the only person in that room who understood what he had just watched begin. Everybody else thought it was over. It was not over. It had not even started yet. The galaxy went quiet after that. Not the kind of quiet that comes from resolution. The kind that comes when everyone decides. together and without discussing it, to pretend something did not happen. 3 years passed. To every species watching from the outside, humanity appeared to be doing exactly what species were expected to do after a loss they couldn't answer. Humanity filed its formal protest with the Conclave Secretariat. Humanity requested a re-examination of the territorial review findings. Humanity sent its diplomatic communications and received polite non-committal responses. The Vrakai Dominion filed no follow-up actions. The coalition that had pushed the review motion moved on to other business. Axis Prime resumed its slow institutional pace of trade filings and boundary surveys. I was recalled from Axis Prime after the session. I spent 6 months on a desk assignment in London, reading reports and feeling useless, before I was transferred into a new office, one that didn't officially exist yet, with a name that hadn't been approved yet, staffed by people who had been pulled from intelligence services, military planning and xenostrategy research. The office had no sign on its door. The door opened with a standard keycard, same as every other door in the building. Inside, there was a long table, a wall of displays, and 16 people who had all been in similar rooms before, and knew what it meant to be assembled this way. The woman at the head of the table was Admiral Yara Ose. I had heard of her. Everyone in diplomatic and military circles had heard of Yara Ose. She had been 12 years old when her family moved to Port Calvary. She had been off-world, attending an advanced placement program on a transport hub 3 systems away. When the strikes happened, she had received word of what had occurred from a relay station notification, a standard emergency broadcast. Her parents, her younger brother, her grandmother, and 241 neighbors from her settlement block were in the confirmed list. She was now 41 years old. She had spent the intervening 29 years building a career so methodical, so technically precise, and so relentlessly forward-focused that she had risen to fleet admiral without a single court proceeding, a single disciplinary notation, or a single moment of what her evaluators described as unnecessary emotion. She was not cold. Cold implies absence of something. Yara Ose was the opposite. She was full of something that had been carefully organized and stored and was now being put to a very specific use. She looked around the table on my first day in that office and said, without preamble, "We are not going to talk about what happened 3 years ago as a grievance. We are not going to discuss it as an injustice. We are going to treat it as a problem that needs a permanent solution. The solution we are building will have no room for hesitation, no room for half measures, and no room for anyone who cannot separate their personal feelings from their professional function. If you are here, I assume you have already made that separation. If you haven't, the door is behind you." Nobody moved. "Good," she said, and we got to work. What followed was the quietest 3 years I have ever lived through, and also the most concentrated. The Vrakai Dominion, and the Conclave at large, saw nothing to be alarmed about. This was, I came to understand, not an accident. The work being done was not hidden through secrecy alone. It was hidden through the oldest trick in the history of human conflict. Doing things in plain sight, slowly enough that each individual action looked like routine commerce. Orbital shipyards expanded. That happened regularly. Construction contracts were awarded. Standard procedure. Raw material imports from human-controlled asteroid mining operations increased. Understandable given industrial growth targets. New training academies opened on 6 worlds. Workforce development, the official filings said. A series of research grants funded advances in long-range sensor systems, faster-than-light relay architecture, and quietly, buried in a 100-page omnibus funding bill, propulsion efficiency improvements that reduced fleet fuel consumption by a factor that only mattered if you were planning very long operational durations very far from your supply chain. No single item on that list was alarming. Together, they were a picture that only made sense if you knew what you were looking at. I became the person who kept track of the picture. My job in OSI's office was documentation and continuity. Every operation, every contract, every shipyard expansion, every training cohort, I logged it, cross-referenced it, and maintained the running total. I knew at any given moment exactly where humanity stood in its preparations. I kept that count the way I kept the notebook, carefully, without skipping anything, and I watched the people building it. I want to tell you about some of them, because this story is not really about ships or strategies or the mechanics of what came later. It is about people who chose, individually and collectively, to be the answer to something that had been done to people they loved. Lieutenant Commander Petra Shaw was 24 when she joined the program. She had grown up on Luden's Reach, one of the 3 colonies. She had been 6 months old when it was struck. Her parents had survived only because they had been in a subsurface agricultural facility when the Orbital strikes hit. She had grown up on the relief stations, then on a resettlement colony, then on Earth, raised by her mother who worked double shifts for 15 years to give Petra a stable education. Petra Shaw was a propulsion engineer. She worked 16-hour days without complaint, without drama, without ever needing to explain why she was there or how much it meant to her. She just worked. Captain Oliver Hale was 48, a career naval officer who had served on standard patrol routes for 2 decades. He was not from any of the 3 colonies. He had no direct personal loss from the strikes. When asked why he had volunteered for the program, he said only that he had been in the conclave chamber gallery that day, not as an official, but as part of a cultural exchange group, and that he had watched the chamber laugh when Savarath sat down. He said he could not forget that laugh. He said it seemed important not to. Signal specialist Nina Ward was 31, quiet and precise, from a small town in the north of England. Her specialty was communications interception and relay architecture. She was building the systems that would allow human fleets to operate in coordinated silence, exchanging position and status data on frequencies, and in encoding patterns that no galactic standard sensor array was calibrated to detect. She told me once, during a late night in the office when most of the others had gone, that she thought of her work the way a locksmith thinks about a key. You don't make the key until you know exactly what lock you're opening. That was the atmosphere of those 3 years. No speeches, no rallying cries, no declarations of purpose read aloud in dramatic settings. Just people who understood what they were building and why. Working with the kind of focus that doesn't need external fuel, because its source runs too deep to require topping off. OC ran the operation the way she apparently ran everything, methodically, without waste. She held briefings that lasted exactly as long as they needed to. She asked precise questions. She listened to the answers completely before responding. She never raised her voice, and all the time I knew her, she never had to. When she said something was important, the room believed her. Not because of volume or force, but because she was the person in the room who was always most clearly right. Her analysis was sharper than anyone else's. Her ability to hold 10 moving parts in mind simultaneously while tracking the implications of each one was something I have never seen matched. I asked her once, near the end of the 2nd year, how she kept herself from letting the personal weight of it affect her judgment. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "It doesn't affect my judgment, it is my judgment. They are not separate things, Marcus. The reason I can hold this plan together without blinking is because every decision I make is anchored to something real. I am not operating from principle or from policy. I am operating from memory. Memory is the most stable fuel there is, it does not run out." Then she turned back to her display and we did not speak of it again. The Vrakai Dominion, in this same period, was doing what dominant powers do when they believe the threat landscape around them is calm. They expanded. They pushed further into outer territories. They negotiated favorable trade arrangements with 3 mid-tier conclave species. They upgraded their own shipyards and commissioned a new generation of heavy combat vessels. Not in response to any assessed threat, but as routine modernization. Their intelligence services continued to file quarterly assessments on the major species. The human assessment, every quarter, read essentially the same. Continued low-level military development consistent with standard security posture. No elevated threat detected. Recommendation, monitor at current priority level. Current priority level was low. Savarath, from Karathi space, sent 1 communication in those 3 years. It was addressed to the Conclave's General Archive, not to any specific delegate or body, a submission of historical record rather than a diplomatic message. It was a comparative analysis of 7 historical civilizations that had suffered significant, unpunished military aggression from a more powerful neighbor. It tracked what each civilization did in the decade following. It was dry, academic, thoroughly documented, and deeply alarming if you read it with attention. It was catalogued, archived, and read by approximately no one. I read it. I read it twice. I added a note to my documentation file. Savarath is still watching. By the end of year 3, the picture in my logs had reached the point where I could look at it and see the shape of what it would become. I am not going to describe that shape in detail here, because the details were not really the point. The point was the totality. The point was that, quietly, without announcement, without drama, without a single formal declaration of intent, humanity had transformed itself. The transformation was not just material, not just ships and weapons and logistics chains, though those were present and enormous and carefully concealed within the architecture of normal commerce. The transformation was also in the people, in the generation that had grown up after the strikes. In the students who had chosen military academies over civilian universities at rates that had never been seen before, in the engineers who had taken propulsion and weapons contracts instead of the higher-paying positions in civilian development, in the doctors who had joined field medicine programs specifically designed for mass casualty response in hostile space environments. No one told them to do these things. No draft notice, no government recruitment campaign, no stirring public address from a leader calling them to service. They simply looked at what had happened, and at the silence that had followed it, and they made individual decisions that, in aggregate, amounted to a collective choice. I sat at my desk on the last day of year 3 and looked at the total count in my documentation logs. Then I opened my notebook. I read the names and numbers on the first page. Then I turned to the back pages where I had been keeping a secondary count, not of the lost, but of the prepared, the ships, the trained personnel, the systems that were ready. The two numbers were not equal. Nothing could make them equal. But the second number was now large enough to matter. O.C. called me into her office that evening. She was standing at her window, looking out at the lights of the city. She did not turn around when I came in. "We are ready," she said. I did not ask ready for what. I knew what. "When?" I asked. "I'll let you know," she said. "Get some sleep, Marcus. You're going to want to be sharp for the next part." I went home. I did not sleep for a long time. When I finally did, I dreamed of Luden's Reach as it had been in the archived images I had seen, green and wide. A young world full of people who had gone there to build something new. In the dream it was morning there, and the sky was the color of shallow water, and everyone was still alive. I woke up before the alarm. I was sharp. The Vrakai Dominion's High Command received its first indication that something was wrong at 4:17 in the morning, station time. On the 209th day of the 4th year, the indication was that 11 of their communication relay stations went silent within a span of 4 minutes. Not damaged, not destroyed, silent. As in, transmitting normally one moment and then simply not transmitting the next. No distress signal. No final burst of damaged data static. No debris cloud on sensor readings. Just 11 stations that had been there, and then were not reachable, as if they had been erased from the map with a careful hand. I was on the bridge of the Unbroken when it happened. The Unbroken was the flagship of Admiral O.C.'s first strategic fleet, a vessel that had been built in the 3rd year of our preparation and named quietly without ceremony by a shipyard crew, most of whom had family on one of the 3 colonies. I had no military role on that bridge. I was an observer, the same function I had held on Axis Prime, watching and recording and understanding what I saw. O.C. stood at the central command platform and watched the tactical display update in real time as her fleet commanders reported in from across. 17 separate approach vectors. I counted them as they came in one by one, every single one exactly on time. I had been given a general outline of the operational plan in year 2, updated briefings in year 3, and the full picture 6 weeks before we departed. I knew the 17 vectors, I knew the targets on each one, I knew the sequencing. But knowing a plan and watching it execute are 2 different experiences. What I was watching now on that display was not the human military operation I had spent 3 years documenting. It was the result of it. The Vrakai Dominion's command and logistics architecture had been mapped, over 3 years, with extraordinary care. Nina Ward's communications interception work had given O.C.'s planners a complete picture of how the Dominion's fleets communicated, how their supply chains ran, and, most critically, which nodes in their network were load-bearing. Remove a perimeter world and you hurt them on the edge. Remove a supply hub and you inconvenience them for months. Remove a communications relay cluster and a shipyard system and a fuel depot chain simultaneously, and you do not hurt a corner of their capability. You hurt their ability to be a coherent military force at all. That was what the 17 vectors were doing, not attacking Vrakai worlds, not targeting population centers, not burning cities or bombardment of inhabited surfaces. Every target on every vector was a military asset. Shipyards, relay stations, fuel processing platforms, command and control installations, fleet staging areas. The operational orders were explicit. No strikes on civilian infrastructure. No actions against non-military targets. O.C. had written that herself, and she had written it first, before anything else in the plan, and she had made every commander sign it by name. This mattered to her. It mattered for reasons that went beyond tactics. She had grown up in the memory of what it felt like to be the civilian target. She would not do that. She would do everything else that needed doing, but she would not do that. I watched the first confirmed engagement data come through from Vector 9, Fleet Commander Oliver Hale's strike group, hitting the Dominion's primary Outer Rim shipyard complex. The engagement lasted 22 minutes. When it was over, a facility that had taken the Dominion 6 years to construct, and that represented a significant fraction of their new vessel production capacity, was a debris field. Hale's voice came through the command channel. It was calm. It gave the standard after-action report in standard sequence. No extra words, no commentary. OC acknowledged it. Moved to the next update. On Vector 14, the Vrakai had managed to get 2 patrol vessels into an intercept position before the strike group reached its target. Petra Shaw's propulsion systems performed exactly as designed. The human strike group outran the intercept, completed its mission, and was out of engagement range before the patrol vessels could close to effective distance. On Vector 3, a Vrakai garrison station attempted to broadcast a distress call to Regional Command. The distress call found only silence where Regional Command's relay infrastructure had been. The call went nowhere. I watched this for 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, the Vrakai Dominion had lost contact with 40% of its outer network. Their heavy fleet, which had been concentrated in the core systems, was still intact. But it was intact in the way that a fist is intact when you have just removed the arm it belongs to. Powerful in isolation, unable to connect to the network of supply and communication that made it a coherent force. Then, at the 7-hour mark, OC ordered the second phase. If the first phase was a surgeon's cuts precise, targeted, designed to disable rather than destroy, the second phase was the statement. Human fleets entered the Dominion's primary trade corridor, the deep space route that connected their core systems to the outer territories, and established a blockade. Not a temporary patrol presence. A blockade, the kind that says, nothing comes in and nothing goes out until we decide otherwise. The Vrakai High Command, working now with degraded communications and a fractured outer network, sent an emergency response force toward the trade corridor. It was a substantial force, a significant portion of their remaining operational fleet. It arrived to find OC's second strategic fleet waiting. I was not present for that engagement. I was still on the bridge of the Unbroken, which had moved to a staging position outside the corridor. I watched it on the tactical display. It lasted 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, the Vrakai Emergency Response Force had retreated to their core systems, with losses I will not detail here beyond saying that they were serious. The Vrakai Admiral commanding that force opened a communication channel immediately after the retreat. He addressed it to the human fleet in general and asked to speak to whoever was in command. OC accepted the channel. The Vrakai Admiral introduced himself. He said that he was prepared to discuss a ceasefire. He said that his forces would withdraw from all disputed territories. He named 3 sectors along the outer boundary as potential negotiated concessions, he said. He hoped that the current hostilities could be paused while formal discussions were opened. OC listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Admiral, I want to be clear with you about something. We are not here for sectors. We are not here for territorial concessions or boundary adjustments or negotiated pauses. We are here because your Dominion destroyed 3 human colony worlds and killed a very large number of our people. And then your ambassador stood in the conclave chamber and called it a territorial correction. And then the body that exists to prevent exactly this kind of event awarded you no consequence whatsoever. What we are doing is not a counteroffer in a negotiation. It is a consequence, and it is not finished," the Vrakai Admiral said. "Then what are your terms?" OC said. "I will tell you when I have them. You will know when we're ready for that conversation. Until then, I suggest you advise your High Command to consider very carefully what they want the next 3 months to look like." She closed the channel. I stared at the tactical display for a long moment. Then I looked at OC. She was already looking at the next set of incoming fleet reports. "Write it down," she said, without looking at me. She knew I always had the notebook. I wrote it down. The second report that came in from Vector 6 was the one that made me understand, for the first time, what a year of watching plans on paper actually meant when those plans became motion in the real world. Vector 6 was Commander Nina Ward's assignment. Not because she was a field commander, she was not, and she had never claimed to be, but because the target on Vector 6 was the Vrakai's primary deep space communication hub. The installation had 12 relay towers arranged in a geometric pattern that allowed the Dominion to route messages across 4-star systems simultaneously. Destroying it from the outside would have been straightforward but loud. The human approach was quieter. Ward's team had spent 18 months mapping the specific frequency architecture of that hub's internal operating system. The strike they delivered was not explosive. It was a signal, a precisely calibrated pulse broadcast at the resonant frequency of the hub's own power cycling infrastructure. causing every tower in the array to attempt a simultaneous hard reboot that its cooling systems could not manage. The hub went dark without a single visible detonation. From the outside, on any sensor array not specifically designed to detect that exact signal, it looked like a power failure. I thought about Nina Ward, in the office 3 years ago, talking about locksmiths and keys. I thought about her sitting at a desk with headphones on, listening to Vrakai communication frequencies for 18 months, building a perfect picture of a lock that she had just opened with a key she made herself. I wrote that down too. By hour 10, the picture on the tactical display had a shape to it that I could finally see in full. Osi had been looking at it all along. She had designed it. After all, but for me it was only now, watching it assemble in real time, that the scope became clear. This was not an attack on a border. It was not a punitive raid. It was not the kind of military action that starts a conflict and then requires a series of further conflicts to resolve. It was a specific thing, engineered to produce a specific outcome, and every piece of it was calculated to that outcome and nothing else. I thought about what Osi had said to the Vrakai admiral on the channel. "We are not here for sectors, no. They were here to permanently reduce the Dominion's ability to ever again put together a strike force capable of what it had done to Luden's Reach, Port Calvary, and New Eden's Gate. They were here to take away the mechanism, not the house, not the people, the mechanism." I found myself thinking about the difference between punishment and prevention. Punishment satisfies something in the short term. Prevention satisfies something in the long term. Humanity had been accused, often throughout its history, of conflating the two, of performing prevention as cover for punishment, of using the language of security to justify the satisfaction of anger. I did not think that was what was happening here. I thought about OSI's operational orders: no civilian infrastructure, no population centers, every target military and specifically military. I thought about the legal framework that had been quietly filed in year 2, sitting in the Conclave archive, waiting to be needed. Punishment, in the shape OSI was building, was a component, real consequences for real actions, but it was structured, bounded, and oriented toward the future. It was designed to hold for 100 years, not to satisfy a feeling for a day. I did not know if I was right about that. I am still not entirely sure. Those are the kinds of questions that do not have clean answers. And anyone who tells you they do is probably trying to sell you something. But I know what I saw in those 4 years of preparation. And I know what I watched on that tactical display. And I do not believe the people who built it were doing it for the wrong reasons. I believe they were doing it because of the names and numbers in my notebook. And because of the silence that had followed those names and numbers. And because someone had to, and they had decided that someone would be them. The third phase of the operation was not on any tactical display. It did not register as a military event. It was not announced over any command channel. It happened at the desks of 41 human diplomatic staff, spread across 12 different conclave member worlds, working quietly through the correct procedural channels over the course of 3 weeks, following the opening of operations. What they were doing was filing the legal framework, the document that had been archived in year 2, as a formal conclave proceeding. They were not asking for permission. They were not requesting a hearing. They were activating a process that already existed within the conclave's own rules, citing those rules correctly and completely, and putting the Vrakai High Command's actions before a body that now, in the context of everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks, could not easily dismiss it as a low-priority filing. I had watched Cornwell file the original protest 3 years earlier, and watched it go nowhere. These filings were different. The Conclave Secretariat received them, and this time did not file them under low priority. This time, the weight of what humanity had demonstrated over the previous 14 days provided its own argument for taking the paperwork seriously. When I told Osi that the legal filings had been accepted for formal processing, she simply nodded. "Right on time," she said. I asked her how long she had been planning the legal component. She said, "Since the day Cornwell's original protest was ignored. If the tribunal framework wasn't ready at the same time as the operational capacity, one without the other would be incomplete. Force without accountability is just retaliation. Accountability without force would never have reached a hearing. You need both, or you have neither." I did not write that down. I put it in my memory, which is a different kind of notebook, and I have not lost it. On the 22nd day of operations, the Vrakai Dominion's High Command submitted a formal request for ceasefire and preliminary peace terms. The request was addressed to Osi's command, to the Conclave Secretariat, and to Earth's Directorate simultaneously. Osi read it and set it aside. The directorate acknowledged receipt and said terms would be discussed when operations concluded. The Conclave Secretariat forwarded it to the newly activated Legal Proceedings Framework. The High Command sent a second request 4 days later, with modified terms. They were prepared to offer more significant territorial concessions. They were prepared to discuss the Command Responsibility Framework. They were prepared to commit to a formal acknowledgement of what had been done. Ozzy read this one too. She came to find me in the observer section of the communications suite. She sat down beside me and looked at the summary on the display. "They're ready," she said. "Ready for what?" "Ready to end it properly," she said. "There is a difference between a force that has been stopped and a force that has accepted being stopped. We're close to the second one. When you get there, you push the proceedings forward." She looked at me. "Start thinking about who you want in the tribunal observer section. You have earned a seat." She stood and went back to the command section. I opened the notebook to a fresh page and began making a list. I wrote at the top of it, "People who should see this through to the end." And I wrote the names of every person I had known in that long, quiet, furious preparation one after the other, until I had filled 2 pages. Then I turned back to the first page where the colony names were, and I read them once more. I closed the notebook and went to make the arrangements. The emergency session of the Galactic Conclave was called 11 days after the opening of human military operations in Vrakai space. I attended it. By that point, the situation had developed in ways that the Conclave's member species found deeply uncomfortable. The Vrakai Dominion, which had for 2 generations been the Conclave's most powerful faction, the species whose endorsement of any resolution nearly guaranteed its passage, whose ambassador had once sat in that chamber and laughed at an old Karathi elder, was no longer projecting power. It was managing a crisis. Its outer network had not been restored. The trade corridor blockade remained in place. 3 of its major shipyard systems were non-operational. Its fleet had not broken the human blockade. Its high command had sent 4 separate communication requests to OC's office asking about terms. None had been answered yet. Into the situation came the emergency session, called by a coalition of 5 mid-tier species who described themselves as deeply concerned about galactic stability. These were not the same 5 species that had pushed the territorial review resolution 3 years ago, but 4 of them had been in that group. And the overlap was not something I found difficult to notice. The coalition's resolution called for an immediate ceasefire, a withdrawal of human forces to pre-engagement positions, and the opening of formal mediation proceedings under the Conclave's dispute resolution framework. It further called for economic sanctions and potential military response measures against humanity. If the ceasefire demand was not honored within 30 days, the resolution was read aloud in that same curved chamber, with those same layered tiers of seated delegates, under those same acoustics that carried every word to the highest gallery. When the reading was finished, Earth's director addressed the chamber. I will tell you about the director, because she deserves more than a title. Her name was Helen Cross. She was 63 years old. She had been born in a resettlement housing block to parents who had come from one of the 3 colonies, from Port Calvary, specifically, which had been her mother's home. She had grown up in circumstances that would generously be described as difficult and accurately be described as the direct consequence of an unpunished atrocity. She had worked in civil administration for 30 years, rising through positions that nobody glamorous wanted, doing the hard, unglamorous work of governing a species in recovery. She had been elected director 4 years before the military operations began, on a platform that had said almost nothing about the colonies, and almost everything about infrastructure and economic development, because she was wise enough to know that saying what needed to be said openly would give the enemies of what needed doing time to prepare. She did not give speeches, she gave presentations. This one began with a display. A simple list of numbers, projected on the chamber's central visual panel. 3 lines, the names of the 3 colonies and the number of confirmed dead from each. She did not read them aloud. She left them there visible and began to speak. She said that she was aware the coalition had concerns about galactic stability. She said she shared those concerns. She said that humanity had been deeply concerned about galactic stability. On the day that 3 of its worlds were struck without warning or provocation, and she would like to ask which member of the coalition had introduced a resolution on that occasion. No one answered. The silence was the answer. She said that humanity would consider the coalition's ceasefire request with exactly the same seriousness that Conclave had applied to the Vrakai Dominion's unpunished attack. Then she paused to let that settle. She said that humanity was aware the coalition had the capability to impose economic sanctions. She said that humanity's trade dependencies on coalition member species had been carefully reviewed, and that humanity had been working, over the past several years, to reduce those dependencies to a level that made sanctions painful but survivable. She said this not to threaten anyone, but because the conclave, she believed, should operate with accurate information. She said that humanity was equally aware that the coalition's resolution included provision for a collective military response. She said that she hoped the coalition's member species had reviewed the engagement data from the past 11 days before including that provision, because she would not want anyone present to make a decision based on an outdated assessment of the relevant capabilities. She asked the chamber to look again at the numbers on the display. She said, "I want to ask the chair a question, not a procedural question, a real one. 3 years ago, in this chamber, an elder of the Karathi people stood and warned this body about what would happen if those people," and she pointed at the numbers, "were not given justice. He was laughed at, not by children or by the uniformed or by the uninformed, by the recognized representatives of civilizations that have been in this conclave for generations. I want to know which of those representatives today believes that Savarath was wrong." The chamber was silent. She said, "We will accept the sanctions. We want the conclave to understand that clearly. Cut our trade access, freeze our assets, do what you believe you must do, and we will continue our operations, because this is not a war aim. We are not trying to gain territory. We are not trying to expand our influence or renegotiate our standing in this body. We are doing something that has a specific purpose that will end when that purpose is achieved, after which we will come back to this chamber, and we will resume our seat, and we will participate in this institution with full good faith. But we will not be stopping before we are done." She gathered her materials. She said, very quietly, "One last thing. Those are not numbers on that display. They were people. The day someone in this chamber treats them as such will be the day this institution becomes what it claims to be." She sat down. 2 of the coalition species withdrew their support from the resolution before the session continued. The motion passed, but in a diminished form. The military response provision was removed by amendment. The sanctions portion passed on a reduced majority. OSE received the sanctions notification and acknowledged it in a 3-line response that said, "Humanity accepted the sanctions, understood the coalition's position, and was continuing operations." I was in the corridor outside the main chamber after the session ended, sitting on a bench and writing in my notebook, when a door opened and a Vrakai dignitary came out. He was not a delegate. He was part of the support staff, younger. His formal robe not quite as elaborate as the ones the senior figures wore. He looked around, saw me, and came over. He sat down beside me. He said he knew who I was. He said he had a message from certain members of the Dominion's diplomatic corps. He said those members were willing to discuss a private arrangement, a consulting contract, technically, for work that would involve me advocating, within human government channels, for the opening of peace negotiations on terms that would be favorable to both parties. He set a small data chip on the bench between us. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up and held it out to him. I said, "Take this back." He said that the amount involved was significant, that I should consider my future, that wars end and careers go on, and there were people in the Dominion who were prepared to remember, with generosity, those who helped bring things to a close. I said, "I understand what you're offering, and I understand why you came to me specifically, because I am not a soldier, and I do not have a rank, and I look like the kind of person who might be persuaded by the framing you just used. But I want you to hear me clearly. The decision you are asking me to influence is not mine to influence. No individual human is in a position to decide when this ends or on what terms. That is not how this works. The reason that is not how this works is because of what you did 3 years ago. You made this not about policy or strategy or any individual's judgment. You made it personal for every single one of us, and you cannot buy your way out of personal." He took the chip back. He stood. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not easily read. Then he left. I sat in the corridor for a while longer. The notebook was open in my lap. I found myself on the page with the 3 colony names and the 3 numbers. I looked at them for a long time. Then I closed the notebook and went to find OC's briefing team because there was still more to do. The chamber proceedings lasted most of the day. I sat through all of it and did not leave once. I had a responsibility to be present for the whole thing. Not because anyone required it of me, but because I had been present for the beginning, and it seemed important to see it from this end with the same attention I had given it from that one. Helen Cross presented the human position with the same plain, precise delivery she had used for everything. She did not raise her voice. She did not use dramatic pauses for effect. She used data and sequence and the specific, documented record of what had occurred from the first day of the strikes to the current hour. She used the conclave's own rules, cited correctly, to demonstrate that the actions taken by humanity were not the actions of a rogue actor operating outside the framework of galactic law. They were, she said, the actions of a member species that had waded through every available institutional channel, had found those channels closed to it, and had exercised the right of response that the conclave's own founding documents explicitly reserved for member species that suffered unprovoked attacks without receiving adequate institutional remedy. It was a legal argument as much as a political one. The lawyers who had drafted the tribunal framework in year 2 had thought about this exact scenario and built the argument into the document. Cross was not improvising. She was delivering a case that had been prepared with the same care as the operational plan. She anticipated the coalition's counter-arguments because they had been anticipated years before. The coalition's representatives raised them anyway, one by one, and Cross or her legal staff answered each one in sequence, citing the relevant provisions and precedents with a patience that I found quietly impressive. 2 hours into the session, one of the coalition's supporting delegates, from a species called the Pelhari, who had no direct connection to the Verkai Dominion and had joined the coalition primarily because of trade relationships, rose and asked to be acknowledged. The chair recognized him. He said in careful and precise language that having heard the full presentation of humanity's legal position, he wished to amend his delegation's endorsement of the coalition's resolution. He said that the resolution as written applied sanctions that, in his delegation's view, could not be justified under the conclave's own founding documents given the documented failure of the institutional process to address the original attack. He said that the Pelhari delegation was withdrawing from the coalition and would be submitting a separate resolution proposing an independent review of the conclave's dispute resolution mechanisms, which had clearly demonstrated a significant failure in the case at hand. He sat down. The chamber murmured. It was a different murmur than the one I had heard 3 years ago. That one had been the sound of calculation. This one was the sound of recalculation. Another coalition member followed 30 minutes later. A smaller withdrawal, a different framing, but the same essential conclusion. They had read the legal record and found that it did not support the position they had taken. The coalition's resolution still passed, but in its reduced form, sanctions only, no military provision. It was a much quieter thing than it had been when it was first introduced. After the session formally closed, I watched Cross gather her materials and speak quietly with her legal team. She was efficient and unhurried, the same as always, but I noticed that when one of her junior staff said something to her that made her smile, the smile stayed for longer than professional courtesy required. It was not triumph. It was something quieter than triumph. It was the expression of a person who had held something together long enough to see it reach the right place. I recognized the expression. I had seen it on OC's face once, very briefly, the morning after the trade corridor blockade was confirmed as holding, just a moment, and then she was back to the display. But it had been there. It is a particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from having won something, but from having finished something that needed finishing. They are not the same feeling. Winning is loud and immediate. Finishing is quiet. It settles. It takes a moment to understand what it is. I was understanding what it was. After Cross left the chamber, I found an empty section of seats in the lower tier and sat down. The chamber was emptying around me, the delegates and their staff moving in streams toward the exits. Conversation resuming at normal volume now that the formalities were over. The central display had gone dark. The curved walls held the quiet echo of all the words that had been spoken in them today and on every other significant day in my time on Axis Prime. I thought about the first time I had sat in the observer gallery of this chamber. I thought about Drathko Van and his dismissive laugh. I thought about Savarath standing still and speaking words that nobody in this room had the intention of hearing. I thought about Cornwell, walking out with her head up. I thought about how much had been built and moved and decided in the space between that day and this one. How many people had worked in quiet offices and shipyards and engineering bays and communication suites to produce the thing that had made today's session possible. How many mornings had been begun with the specific anchoring weight of knowing what you were doing and why? I thought about a woman on a transport hub, receiving a relay station notification, and deciding what to do with it. The chamber was almost empty now. A cleaning crew had come in and was working their way along the lower tier, moving methodically. I stood and walked to the exit, in the corridor. I passed a group of Rakai diplomatic staff moving in the opposite direction, headed somewhere with the focused urgency of people managing a crisis. I stepped to one side to let them pass. One of them young, probably not much older than I had been when I first arrived on Axis Prime, made brief eye contact with me as he went by. His expression was difficult to read, not hostile, not calculating, something closer to tired. I did not say anything to him. He did not say anything to me. He went on down the corridor with his colleagues, and I went the other way, and that was the whole of it. Outside in the main concourse, I found a quiet corner near a wide viewport and sat on a bench. I took out the notebook. I did not open it immediately. I just held it for a moment, feeling the worn corners under my fingers, thinking about the first time I had opened it with the specific intention of writing something that mattered. I opened it to a page near the middle, where I had written a note during the second year of preparation. It said, "Remember that the goal is the thing, not the feeling about the thing. The goal is specific and finite and structural. Do not let the weight of it collapse into something formless." I had written it as a reminder to myself, on a night when the weight had felt particularly heavy and the goal had felt particularly far away. I looked at it now from the other side of it. Then I closed the notebook and put it back in my pocket, stood up, and went to find OC's briefing team, because there was still more to do, and there would continue to be more to do too until the last of it was finished properly. But something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure. The work ahead was real, and it was substantial, but it was the work of completion, rather than the work of construction. The structure had been built. Now it was a matter of finishing the last rooms and making sure they held. I could do that. I had been doing exactly that, in one form or another. For 4 years I kept walking. The tribunal was held on Axis Prime. It was held there because the Conclave's legal framework, whatever its failures, still provided the most neutral administrative infrastructure for proceedings that needed to be recognized across multiple species' legal traditions. It was held there because OC had insisted on it, not for symbolic reasons, but because she wanted the proceedings to be unimpeachable. Whatever came out of that chamber had to hold. It had to hold for a century if it needed to. It had to be the kind of thing that could not be undone by the next powerful faction that decided the outcome was inconvenient. She had thought about this the way she thought about everything. From first principles, from the requirement for durability. The legal framework had been drafted in the second year of our preparation. I had read every version of it. It had been written by a team of 12 lawyers, 6 of whom had family histories directly connected to the 3 colonies, and 6 of whom had been deliberately selected because they did not. Because OC wanted arguments that worked on pure legal merit, not arguments that could be dismissed as motivated. The framework they produced was careful, thorough, and anchored in precedents from 4 separate species jurisprudence systems. It covered the definition of an unprovoked strike against civilian population centers, the command responsibility chain for ordered military actions, the standard of evidence required for individual accountability, and the structure of reparations proportional to demonstrated harm. It had been submitted to the Conclave's legal archive quietly as an academic filing in year 2. It had been there, on record, for over 2 years before anyone needed it. When it was needed, it was ready. The proceedings lasted 47 days. I was present for most of them. I was not there as a lawyer or a witness. I was there as myself, the person who had been in that chamber on the first day, who had watched the whole thing unfold from the beginning, who had kept a record of it. I sat in the observer section and I watched. The Vrakai officers who had ordered and executed the strikes were present. Some had been brought to Axis Prime under detention arrangements negotiated as part of the operational end-state terms. Others had come voluntarily, on legal counsel's advice, because the alternative was a default judgment that offered them no recourse. They were treated correctly, not with warmth, but with the procedural fairness that the framework required and that OC had required the framework to require. They had legal representation. They had the right to present their account. They had the right to challenge evidence. They could not challenge the evidence effectively because the evidence was comprehensive. 3 years of careful documentation, plus the records recovered from Dominion military systems during the operations, produced a chain of accountability so complete that the factual record was not seriously contested. The legal arguments were about framing and precedent and jurisdiction. On those arguments, the legal team that had spent 3 years building the framework proved considerably better prepared than the defense. The resulting judgments were not designed to be dramatic. OC had been clear about that too. This was not about humiliation. It was about accountability and prevention. The senior officers were given sentences that were structured to remove them from any military or governmental role permanently. The Dominion itself was placed under a demilitarization agreement with century-long oversight provisions. The reparations framework was established, specific, measurable, tied to a monitoring structure that would be independently administered. The Dominion would still exist. Its people would still live their lives. But its capacity to order what it had ordered would be structurally dismantled, supervised, and maintained for long enough that the next generation of Rakai children would grow up in a different kind of society, one that had been interrupted from the trajectory it had been on. That was, OC had always maintained the point, not revenge, not the satisfaction of pain repaid with pain, the permanent structural prevention of the thing that had been done. The last session of the tribunal proceedings concluded on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I have the notebook, and I wrote the day of the week in the margin. I do not usually note the day of the week. I must have felt in that moment that the specific day mattered. When the final judgment was read and acknowledged, the chamber began a slow, building sound of recognition. Not quite applause in the human sense, because not all the species present expressed approval that way, but a collective acknowledgement from the observers and staff, and the few member delegates who had chosen to attend. It rose and spread and filled the chamber. I did not stay for it. I stood and I gathered my things, and I walked out of the chamber before the sound fully built. I went through the corridor, past the bench where I had sat on the day. The Vrakai dignitary had offered me a bribe, through the long passage toward the observation level, and up the stairs to the gallery that looked out over the station's main docking approach. The viewport there is wide. You can see a long stretch of open space from it, with the station's approach lane running out into the dark. I stood at it and looked out. There were human vessels in the approach lane. Not combat vessels. These were the transport and supply ships that had been running logistic throughout the operations and were now returning. Along with some of the smaller patrol craft, they moved in slow, orderly procession, their running lights blinking in the particular cadence that human vessels used on final approach to a neutral station. I watched them for a while. Then I heard footsteps, and Savarath came to stand beside me. He was quieter than you would expect from a being his size. He moved through the station the way he did everything, with a composure that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with a very long relationship with time. He stood beside me at the viewport and he did not speak for a moment, and the silence was comfortable in a way that I cannot easily explain. I watched 11 civilizations rise and fall before yours, he said. It was not a dramatic opening. It was a statement, delivered in the same tone he might use to describe the weather in a distant system. All of them had soldiers. All of them experienced loss. All of them developed systems for responding to aggression. None of them combined what you combine, the ability to sustain grief, to carry it actively, without letting it curdle into something uncontrolled, and simultaneously to plan with absolute technical precision over years. Most species do one or the other. They feel or they calculate. You do both at the same time, indefinitely. I did not know what to say to that. I said, "Is that a good thing?" Savarath was quiet for a moment. "It is a profound thing," he said. "Whether it is good depends entirely on what you do with it. Today I believe it was good. I have believed it for some time, actually. Since I watched your admiral refuse a ceasefire offer and explain why, in terms the Vrakai commander clearly found very difficult to understand. He had offered a standard exit, a face-saving arrangement, a mutually acknowledged reduction in hostilities. She explained that she was not in a negotiation. He did not have a framework to understand that. His species, like most species, operates within defined conflict cycles. You do not. We used to, I said. We had plenty of conflict cycles historically. I have read your history, Savarath said. You had conflict cycles, but your grievances did not always end when the cycle ended. They persisted. They were passed through generations. They re-emerged. That is the thing most species find strange about you. Most species grieve and release. You grieve and retain. I thought about that. I thought about Yara Osi, who had been 12 years old on a transport hub when a relay station notification told her about Port Calvary. I thought about Petra Shaw, who had been 6 months old in a subsurface agricultural facility. I thought about Oliver Hale, standing in the observer gallery, watching a chamber laugh at an elder's warning, and being unable to forget the sound of it. Is that why you warned them? I asked. In the session 3 years before this started, you warned them because you had seen this pattern before? Savarath turned from the viewport and looked at me. His eyes were very old. They had the quality of eyes that have watched things end. I warned them, he said, because they needed to be warned. Not because I believed they would listen. I had by then sufficient experience to know that species in positions of comfortable power rarely hear warnings as anything other than theater. But there is a function to warnings that does not depend on them being heeded. A warning, given clearly and on record, becomes testimony. It becomes the moment that the archive contains, that the researchers will find, that the next generation will read when they are trying to understand how something began. I did not warn them for their benefit. I warned them so that the record would be complete. I nodded slowly. History needed a witness. I said yes, Savarath said. It always does. We stood at the viewport together for a while. The human vessels moved in slow procession along the approach lane, lights blinking, each one on its way home. More came while we watched, emerging from the far edge of sensor range and beginning their slow descent toward the station. Docking approaches. Eventually Savarath said he needed to return to his delegation section, and he wished me well in a formal but genuine way, and he left. His footsteps were quiet on the corridor floor. I stayed at the viewport. I took out the notebook. I opened it to the first page and read the 3 names and the 3 numbers. I had read them before every significant event in the past 4 years. I had read them silently to myself, not as a ritual but as a reminder, a way of saying, this is what this is about, this is who this is for. I turned to the last page that had writing on it. Then I turned to the first blank page after that, which was near the back of the notebook. I held the pen for a moment, then I wrote, we did not forgive, we did not forget, we made sure it could never happen again. That is all we ever wanted. I looked at it for a moment, then I closed the notebook. I did not put it back in my pocket this time. I held it in my hands and looked at the cover of it. Plain, dark, slightly worn at the corners from 4 years of being carried. It had been in every room where the decisions were made. It had been in the conclave chamber on the first day, and on the last day. It had been on the bridge of the Unbroken. It had been in the tribunal chamber. It had been on this exact spot before, on the bench in the corridor below. The human ships kept coming. Steady, unhurried, in good order. Their lights blinked in the dark. I thought about Port Calvary in the morning, the way I had dreamed it, green and wide and full of people who had gone there to build something new. I thought about Petra Shaw's mother, working double shifts in resettlement housing so that her daughter could have an education that might add up to something. I thought about Oliver Hale, standing in a gallery, listening to a laugh and deciding he could not forget it. I thought about Osei, telling me that memory is the most stable fuel there is, that it does not run out. I thought about Savarath, 712 years old, standing in a curved chamber full of powerful species who were not going to listen, and speaking anyway, not for them, for the record. Outside, in the dark, another ship emerged from range, found the approach lane and began to move toward home. I watched it until it was close enough that I could make out the hull markings, a transport vessel, mid-weight class, entirely unremarkable, entirely human, entirely quietly on its way home. I stayed at the viewport until there were no more ships coming in. Then I went to find a coffee machine, because it had been a very long few years, and some things remain constant regardless of what the galaxy does around them. The notebook went back into my pocket. I did not think I would need to open it again, but I kept it anyway. You keep things like that, you just do.